Nude bifnelo on Blair Stan, Werfef hief there of neath the Bernam, to help her on to Halla Yawafla, Yif he his Hillestaff Erla. What happens when life leaves us with no easy choice? When comfort disappears, when the hall is far behind us, and all that remains is cold, hunger, duty and need. The runic world has a name for that moment. Need. Now this is most definitely one of the hardest runes to sit with. This is the rune of necessity, of hardship and constraint. But it also carries one of the most powerful messages that we find in Old English literature. Thas over Reoda, Thisses Swa May. That passed, and so may this. Wezaf Hala and Beof Wilkumen. Now welcome back, and today we're going to be looking at the Anglo-Saxon rune Need or Nude. Now before we get into this episode, I have some explaining to do. It has been, I checked before I got here, it has been over 2 years since I made one of these Wyrdwayz, the World of Anglo-Saxon Rune videos. So I think I have some explaining to do. So let me tell you what's been going on. If you were thinking that I had given up on the Anglo-Saxons and I've just been slobbing around doing absolutely nothing, well, you were wrong. I've actually spent the last 18 months working very hard on a book all about the Heathen Anglo-Saxons and their runes. Now, as you can imagine, this has taken an incredible amount of work, research, writing, studying deep into the night, down all sorts of rabbit holes. And I think I'm making good progress. It's a very, very big project, and I must have written around 106,000 words now. And I've now reached the point in the project where I have taken everything that I had previously made as videos and I have turned it into a book manuscript. And as you can see, it's starting to look fairly substantial now. I still have a very long way to go, but I'm definitely getting there. I'm also producing illustrations for the book. I've got a vision of how I want it to look, which does involve a lot of artwork. So far, I think I've completed about 70 illustrations. Now, my original mission has changed tack. From now on, whenever I complete a chapter, I'll make a video that will cover some of the information from the book. So I do hope that you'll join me on this journey. Now that I've explained that, let's get back to this rune. Now in the Elder Futhark, this rune is known as Now These. In Old English it becomes either Need or Nude, There are two different spellings. You can find it spelled either way. Now the meanings of this rune are not gentle ones. We are talking about need, necessity, inevitability, obligation, distress, difficulty, and constraint. In other words, need is the duty that you don't want, but you can't avoid. It's the pressure that closes in around your heart. It's the cold truth that life does not always go the way we want it to, and it doesn't always offer us a choice. I have to say, 2026 for me has been a year with a lot of need energy. It's been a really challenging year. I'm hoping that now we've got into the second half of the year, into the waning half of the year, that things might improve. Let's hope so. Now let's have a look at the rune poems for this rune. Now, because this rune features as part of the younger Futhark, as well as the Old English rune poem, we also have poems from Norway and also Iceland. But we'll start with the Old English rune poem. Nud bifnerlo on bleos stan, weofeth he thea of neither bernam, to helper and to hala ye wafla, yif he his hillestaff alor. And in modern English, that is, hardship oppresses the heart, yet nonetheless often it is transformed for the sons of men to a source of help and salvation, if only they heed it in time. Now I believe, like many Old English rune poems which were written down after Christianization and by monks in ecclesiastical settings, that the original meaning of this rune has been somewhat Christianized. I think if we look to the Icelandic and the Norwegian rune poems, we can gain a better understanding of how this Old English rune poem probably started. So the Norwegian rune poem first. Need leaves little choice, the naked man is chilled by the frost. And the Icelandic rune poem is similar. Need is distress of bondwoman and state of oppression and hard labour. Now it's in these rune poems that we really begin to feel the weight of this nude or need rune. The Old English rune poem says that hardship oppresses the heart. It also says that hardship can become help and healing if it's heeded in time. Perhaps in more contemporary language we could say that necessity is the mother of invention, and sometimes in life a situation which appears very dark and constraining can sometimes, not always, but can sometimes lead to a situation which is ultimately better, even though you had to go through severe hardship in order to get there. So this is an important point. Need is painful, but it's not meaningless. It can warn us, it can teach us, it can force us to notice what otherwise we may ignore. Now obviously the Norwegian rune poem is harsher than the Old English one, as I said. It says that need leaves little choice and that the naked man is chilled by the frost. And of course the Icelandic one is darker still, linking need with oppression, with hard labour, slavery and suffering. So across the traditions we see that nude or need is never just an abstract idea. It's physical, it's cold, it's hunger, it's labour, it's grief and compulsion. The Old English poem says, Nilo on Bleostan. Now, Nilo can mean narrow, oppressive, constricting. This is saying that the energy of need, the nature of need, is oppressive and constricting in the breast. But in Old English, the word bleost can mean stomach, chest, that whole physical area. However, it can also suggest something different, the inner seat of feeling. Now, Old English even gives us the very beautiful word bleost kova, a breast chamber, the heart chamber. Think of it as a hidden room within oneself, almost an inner chamber that nobody else can gain access to. And that is where this rune, nude or need, presses, not just on the physical body, but inward too, into the place where fear and grief and obligation and endurance all meet. For the Anglo-Saxons, exile was one of the most terrible conditions that you could possibly imagine. To be cast out, to lose your kin, your lord, your comrades, the sanctity and safety of the hall, the warmth of the fire, that protection and your identity, well, in the Anglo-Saxon warrior culture, that was the very worst of fates. A warrior without a lord was not simply unemployed, he was socially and spiritually unmade. Now, within Old English poetry, we find a formula used for expressing this state of exile. There are a number of poems that deal with this topic. We'll look at some in a moment. They use words such as Winaleus Lecha, the friendless exile, and Anhaga, the solitary one. Now, I have actually made a previous episode all about exile in Anglo-Saxon times, and I will put a link to that below. Now, these words are not simply labels, they are whole emotional worlds. So let's look at some poems now that deal with the state of exile. Now, the Wanderer and the Seafarer that I have mentioned before are both poems that are found in the Exeter book, and both beautifully capture the experience of warriors, the painful experience of warriors that have been separated from their former lives and now find themselves alone in the world. In the Wanderer, we hear the voice of a man who has lost his lord, he's lost his companions. We don't know how this happened, but we know it has happened. And in this poem, he remembers the mead hall, he remembers the giving of treasure, the warmth of belonging to that comitatus, to that warrior culture, and belonging to his lord. And he wakes to find waves, seabirds, snow, frost, hail. The world that he knew and loved is gone. And we often find in Old English poetry themes of cold and winter being very much associated with misery and suffering. And I guess if you lived in a drafty, cold wooden structure, then winter, a harsh winter, would indeed have been miserable. Now, the Seafarer, another poem which is found in the Exeter book, this gives us another image of a warrior alone. Here we hear of cold feet bound by frost, hunger that tears at the sea-weary spirit, and worries that are hot around the heart. Here we find the cold of the exterior world very much mirrors the inner suffering that this person is feeling. Now in these poems, hardship is not something you can always escape. Sometimes it's something you simply have to endure. Now, as we know, the Anglo-Saxon world was shaped by Wyrd, we would call it now Wyrd, the Germanic concept of fate. It was also shaped by a hard-won stoicism. Now, you couldn't always change what came your way from external forces, but what you could do is meet that face on with courage and control. You could control what happened within your breast kova. This inner sanctum, this inner chamber was something that you and you alone had control over. The outside forces could be kept at bay by a strong spirit. Few Old English poems capture the spirit of need like Daor. Now this poem recalls painful vignettes of imprisonment, loss, longing, exile, tyranny and displacement. And after the poet has given each example of suffering, we have the wonderful refrain, Thas overleoda This's soir may. That passed and so may this. This is very unusual in Old English poetry to have a refrain, but this poet gave a refrain after every example of suffering. Now this should not be viewed as merely shallow optimism. It doesn't pretend that suffering is easy. We all know that suffering is not easy. It simply places that suffering inside time. Even terrible things change. Even grief will move on. Nothing, absolutely nothing, can last forever. Now, a couple of Old English poems which express sorrow, grief, longing from a woman's perspective, which is quite unusual in Old English poetry, are two beautiful poems. One is called Wulf and Eadwacer, which again I have made a whole video about, which I'll link below, and the other is called The Wife's Lament. Now the Wife's Lament tells of a woman's sorrow, grief, resentment, wretchedness after she has been separated from her husband. Her in-laws have turned against her and she has been effectively exiled to go and live within a grove under an oak tree in some kind of cave or barrow of some description. And it's very unusual to hear such emotions from a woman's perspective, but it still uses the same type of language that we find in poems such as The Seafarer and The Wanderer. Now Wulf and Eadwacer, beautiful poem. It gives us the lines, Wulf is on one island, I on another. Wulf is on ear, ich on offerla, fast is that eland finna beworpen. And it's a truly beautiful poem. It's very enigmatic. We don't quite know the backstory. Maybe the audience that heard it did know the backstory. We mustn't forget that the very small amount of Old English poetry that we still have left is probably about 10% of all of the poetry that there was before such terrible events as the Viking invasions, the Reformation, and such events where literature was destroyed en masse. But both of these poems express the energy of this rune, but from a woman's perspective. Now, against exile stands hospitality. And going back to the Yivu rune, within the poem it reminds us that gift giving offers honour, support, mercy and sustenance to the one who has nothing else. Now, in Germanic society, welcoming the stranger, this was not merely a matter of politeness, not at all. It was a sacred obligation. Now, Tacitus, writing in AD 98 of the Germanic tribes on the continent, he tells us that among the Germanic peoples no guest was ever turned away. Behind that custom lies the ancient fear and reverence that the gods themselves would travel the earth disguised as humans. And what we did see post-conversion amongst some members of Anglo-Saxon society is that the older image of exile was transformed for religious purposes. The wild places, the zones of danger, the kind of places that would have been avoided, could become a place for spiritual testing. Such an example, a very good example, is St Guflac of Crowland in Lincolnshire. Now, once a Mercian warrior, he withdrew into the Lincolnshire fens to live as a hermit. Apparently his cell was carved into an old barrow. So the wilderness remained a frightening place. It was outside the hall, it was away from society. But precisely because it was liminal, that place could also be powerful. And in Norse tradition, we hear of the magical practice of uta seta, sitting out, which basically involved seeking wisdom in wild, lonely, isolated places. Here we see hardship becoming a threshold. There is another darker form of need and constraint in Anglo-Saxon society: slavery. It's a very ugly subject, but one which cannot be ignored. Now, I have also made a video about this previously, which I can link, but enslaved people made up a significant section of early medieval society in England. It's very difficult to know how many, but scholars estimate somewhere between 10 and 30% of Anglo-Saxon society were slaves. Some of these were prisoners of war, some had been enslaved as a form of punishment for a crime, some were born into slavery. If you were born of a slave, you instantly became a slave, and there's a word for that, theoborlan. Some were children sold by desperate families facing famine, and some were traded across the sea. So here we find need. It's no metaphor, it's bondage, it's compulsion, and it is the denial of freedom. It's the human cost of a society in which need, power, violence and economy were very tightly bound together. So what does need teach us? It reminds us that life contains hardship, it contains obligation, there is loss, exile, and there is constraint. It asks us to stand and face these cold places in the world, in history, and within ourselves. But the Old English rune poem doesn't leave us there. Hardship may oppress the heart, but as the rune poem says, if it's heeded in time, it can become help and healing. It can expose what matters, it can reveal who stands with us in times of need. It can teach us endurance, resilience, and it can force transformation. Sometimes that's a painful transition. Sometimes it's needed. So need is the rune of the hard road. It's the cold winter outside of the hall. It's the exile's grief. It's the labourer's burden. It's the prisoner's chain. And it is that duty which we simply cannot avoid. But within it is also the knowledge that suffering changes, that hardship can be endured, and that even bad times will pass. Thas overleoda this's swa may. That passed, and so may this. If you found this exploration of this Anglo-Saxon rune nude or need meaningful, then please like this video. I really do appreciate it. Subscribe for more journeys into Old English language, runes, myth and early medieval belief. And let me know if you want to in the comments about times where you have encountered the energy of this rune and any lessons that you gained from it. So once again, I just want to thank all of my subscribers, those who have stuck with me even though I have been very, very quiet for the past 2 years. Those who have joined the tribe recently, even though I haven't been putting out any regular content. I really do appreciate it. I am a small channel. I am on a mission to prove that the Anglo-Saxons are every bit as interesting, as spiritual, as deep as their much more popular cousins, the Norse. We have a rich culture and heritage in this country, and I am trying to get it out there. So thank you. Really do appreciate you taking the time to tune into this video. If you want to know more about anything, maybe some more about my library or my art studio or the book, please drop it in the comments and I'll see what I can do. And all that leaves me to say is farewell and beof hala.